Sarah Matthews stood in the bridal suite of St. Augustine's Cathedral, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the vintage pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. The ivory silk dress cascaded around her like liquid moonlight, and the late afternoon sun streaming through the stained glass windows painted rainbow fragments across the room. In just 30 minutes, she would walk down the aisle to marry David Chen, the man she'd fallen in love with during their graduate studies at Georgetown University. Everything was perfect, or so she thought. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cathedral bells chimed 4 o'clock as Sarah's maid of honor, Jessica, bustled into the room with a concerned expression. "Sarah, there's something strange happening downstairs," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the door. "The priest, Father McKenna, he's acting different. He keeps checking his phone and muttering something about protocols and the mission parameters." Sarah laughed softly, attributing Jessica's worry to pre-wedding jitters. "Jess, you're being paranoid. Father McKenna has been officiating weddings here for over 20 years. He probably just got a text from his sister or something." She turned back to the mirror, applying one final coat of her mother's signature red lipstick, the same shade worn by 3 generations of Matthews women on their wedding days. But Jessica's unease proved contagious. As Sarah descended the cathedral's marble steps toward the main sanctuary, she noticed subtle anomalies that made her stomach flutter with something other than excitement. The usual wedding guests filled the pews, yes, but scattered among her family and friends were faces she didn't recognize. Men and women in dark suits who sat with military precision, their eyes scanning the room with predatory alertness rather than the warm anticipation typical of wedding attendees. David stood at the altar in his charcoal gray tuxedo, looking handsome as ever, but even he seemed different. His usual easy smile appeared forced, and he kept glancing toward the mysterious guests with an expression Sarah had never seen before, part recognition, part apprehension. When their eyes met across the sanctuary, instead of the loving warmth she expected, she saw something that chilled her, an apology. Father McKenna emerged from the sacristy, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't the gentle, elderly priest who had counseled them through their premarital sessions, sharing stories about his 40 years of service and his passion for bringing couples together in God's love. This man moved with the calculated precision of someone much younger, his eyes sharp and alert as they swept across the congregation. Most disturbing of all, there was a barely visible earpiece tucked in his left ear, and his clerical collar seemed to conceal something that looked suspiciously like a high-tech communication device. The processional music began, Pachelbel's canon in D, just as Sarah had requested, but even the familiar melody couldn't calm the growing sense of wrongness that settled over her like a heavy cloak. Her father, Robert Matthews, a retired federal judge, took her arm at the back of the cathedral, but his grip was tense and she noticed his eyes darting toward the mysterious guests with the same wariness she'd observed in David. "Dad, who are those people?" Sarah whispered as they began their slow walk down the aisle. Robert's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm not entirely sure, sweetheart, but I have my suspicions. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, I need you to remember that your mother and I love you more than life itself, and that sometimes the people we love most have to make choices that seem impossible to understand." The cryptic response sent ice through Sarah's veins, but before she could press for clarification, they had reached the altar. David stepped forward to receive her from her father's arm, and the familiar comfort of his touch should have eased her fears. Instead, the tremor in his hands and the tension in his shoulders only amplified her growing sense that this was no ordinary wedding ceremony. Father McKenna opened the leather-bound ceremony book, but Sarah noticed it wasn't the traditional wedding liturgy she had expected. The pages seemed to contain texts that looked more like a briefing document than religious scripture. And when he looked up at the congregation, his smile was cold and professional rather than warm and paternal. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill every corner of the vast cathedral. "We are gathered here today not merely to witness the union of two souls in holy matrimony, but to initiate a covenant of far greater significance." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the mysterious guests who had straightened in their seats with obvious anticipation. "Sarah Elizabeth Matthews and David Chen, you stand before this assembly not only as bride and groom, but as candidates selected for a mission that will test the very foundations of your commitment, not just to each other, but to something larger than yourselves." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed the priest's words. This wasn't the ceremony they had rehearsed just 24 hours earlier. This wasn't the traditional wedding service she had dreamed of since childhood. David's hand squeezed hers, and when she looked into his eyes, she saw a mixture of love and desperation that made her knees weak. "What's happening?" she whispered, but Father McKenna continued as if she hadn't spoken.
"The bonds you are about to enter into," Father McKenna continued, his voice carrying across the cathedral with unsettling authority, "extend far beyond the traditional promises of marriage. They encompass duty to your country, loyalty to an organization that has watched over both of your families for generations, and acceptance of a legacy that has been carefully cultivated throughout your entire lives." Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to process the priest's words. Legacy? Organization? She glanced desperately at her parents in the front pew, searching for some sign that this was an elaborate joke or misunderstanding. But her mother's tear-stained face and her father's grim expression told her this was terrifyingly real. Around the sanctuary, the mysterious guests had produced small recording devices, documenting every word with the efficiency of trained professionals. "David," Father McKenna addressed her fiancé directly, "step forward and acknowledge your inheritance." To Sarah's horror, David released her hands and stepped toward the altar. From beneath his tuxedo jacket, he withdrew a slim black folder that he handed to the priest with military precision. Sarah had never seen that folder before, had no idea where it could have come from, and the casual way David produced it suggested he'd been carrying it all along, which meant this moment had been planned, orchestrated, anticipated by everyone except her. "Sarah Elizabeth Matthews," the priest's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, "daughter of federal judge Robert Matthews and Dr. Eleanor Matthews, granddaughter of OSS operative Catherine Matthews and CIA Deputy Director James Matthews. You have been observed, evaluated, and deemed suitable for recruitment into the organization that has protected American interests in the shadows for over 70 decades. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. OSS operative? CIA deputy director? Her grandmother Catherine had been a librarian, hadn't she? Her grandfather James had worked for the State Department, according to family stories. But as she looked at her parents' faces, she saw the truth written in their expressions. Every family story had been a carefully constructed lie. Every casual conversation about grandparents and family history had been scripted to hide a reality she was only now beginning to glimpse. Your academic achievements at Georgetown University, your linguistic abilities, your psychological profile, and your capacity for adapting under pressure have all been thoroughly documented. Father McKenna continued, consulting the folder David had provided. Your relationship with David Chen was not the coincidence you believed it to be, but rather a carefully orchestrated introduction designed to evaluate your compatibility as operational partners. Sarah's legs nearly gave out beneath her. Her love story, their meet-cute in the university library, their first date at that little Italian restaurant near campus, their shared dreams of traveling the world together, had it all been fake? She turned to David, searching for his face for some sign of the man she thought she knew, but his expression had transformed into something cold and professional that matched the mysterious guests scattered throughout the cathedral. "David," The priest addressed her fiancé again, son of Dr. Michael Chen and Professor Linda Chen, both of whom have served as assets for the organization since their immigration from Taiwan in 1987. You have successfully completed your preliminary assignment. Your psychological evaluation of Sarah Matthews confirms her suitability for advanced operational training. The cathedral seemed to spin around Sarah as the full magnitude of the deception crashed over her. David's parents, whom she'd grown to love over the past 2 years, were spies? David himself was apparently some kind of operative? Her own family history was built on lies? And this wedding, this moment she had anticipated as the beginning of her real life, was actually some kind of recruitment ceremony for an organization she'd never heard of? No, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast space. This isn't real. This isn't happening. But Father McKenna pressed on relentlessly. Sarah Matthews, do you understand that the life you have lived until this moment has been a preparation, a carefully constructed environment designed to develop your natural abilities while maintaining the cover of normalcy necessary for deep operational work? Sarah looked desperately around the cathedral, seeking some anchor of reality in the sea of revelations that threatened to drown her. Her college roommates sat in the third pew, but their expressions weren't the confused shock she expected. They were watching the proceedings with calm attention, as if they too were part of whatever massive deception had shaped her entire existence. Your academic thesis on Eastern European political structures was not simply academic work, but a detailed intelligence analysis that has already been integrated into current operational planning. Your summer internship at the State Department was not an educational opportunity, but a security clearance evaluation conducted by personnel who have been monitoring your development since childhood. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Her thesis advisor's unusual interest in her work, the way certain library resources had been mysteriously available when she needed them, the State Department supervisor who had seemed to know more about her family history than she did herself. It had all been orchestrated, managed, controlled by people who had been pulling invisible strings throughout her entire life. David, Sarah turned to the man she thought she was about to marry, her voice breaking with the weight of betrayal. Tell me this isn't real. Tell me you love me not because some organization told you to, but because you actually love me. David's facade cracked for just a moment, and she saw a flash of the man she had fallen for, vulnerable, conflicted, genuinely torn. Sarah, he whispered, I do love you. That part was never fake, but everything else has been leading to this moment.
The cathedral fell into an oppressive silence as Sarah processed David's admission. The weight of his words, that his love might be genuine, but everything else about their relationship had been a lie, created a hollow ache in her chest that threatened to consume her. She looked at the man she had planned to spend her life with, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. The subtle calluses on his hands that she had attributed to rock climbing were actually from weapons training. The way he always seemed to know which restaurants had the best exit routes wasn't romantic planning, but operational awareness. His uncanny ability to read people and situations wasn't just emotional intelligence, but professional skill honed through years of training she had never suspected. The choice before you, Sarah Matthews, Father McKenna's voice cut through her devastating realization, is not whether to accept this mission. Your genetics, your upbringing, your education, and your psychological makeup have already determined your suitability. The choice is whether you will embrace your destiny willingly, with full understanding of what it means, or whether you will require more persuasive measures to ensure your cooperation. The implied threat in those words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She glanced toward the cathedral's exits and noticed for the first time that the mysterious guests had positioned themselves strategically throughout the sanctuary, not just as witnesses, but as guards. The fairy tale ending she had envisioned was rapidly transforming into a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape.
What exactly is this organization? Sarah asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, despite the chaos raging in her mind. What kind of mission requires lying to someone for their entire life? Father McKenna smiled, but it was the cold expression of a predator rather than the warm comfort of a spiritual guide. The organization has no official name, no public presence, no acknowledged existence in any government record. We are the people who handle situations too sensitive for traditional intelligence agencies, who solve problems that require complete deniability, who protect American interests through methods that can never be connected to official channels. He gestured toward the mysterious guests scattered throughout the cathedral. Your parents, David's parents, your thesis advisor, your State Department supervisor, even your childhood piano teacher, all of them have been part of the network that has been preparing you for this moment. Every skill you've learned, every experience that has shaped your character, every relationship that has influenced your development has been carefully orchestrated to create the perfect operative. Sarah's mind flashed through memories that now took on sinister new meanings. Her piano teacher's emphasis on finger dexterity and hand-eye coordination, her parents' insistence on foreign language study, the way certain opportunities had always seemed to present themselves at exactly the right moments. It had all been manipulation, a decades-long grooming process disguised as normal childhood experiences. "And if I refuse?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Refusal is not an option available to you," Father McKenna replied with chilling matter-of-factness. "Your psychological profile indicates that you will ultimately choose cooperation once you fully understand the consequences of resistance. Your parents, David's parents, your younger sister currently studying abroad in Prague, your best friend Jessica standing beside you as maid of honor, all of their safety depends on your willingness to accept your role." The threat was unmistakable, and Sarah felt the walls of her world collapsing inward. Everyone she loved was apparently either part of this conspiracy or a potential victim of it. The illusion of choice was just another form of manipulation, designed to make her feel like she had some control over a situation that had been predetermined long before she was born. Jessica stepped forward, and Sarah turned to her oldest friend with desperate hope. Surely Jessica would help her, would stand with her against this insanity. But the expression on Jessica's face was professional rather than supportive, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same authoritative tone that Father McKenna had been using. "Sarah, I've been your handler for the past 8 years, Jessica said quietly. Our friendship is real, but it began as an assignment to monitor your emotional development and ensure your psychological stability remained within acceptable parameters for operational work." The betrayal cut deeper than anything that had come before. Jessica, her confidant, her sister in all but blood, the person who had held her through breakups and celebrated her successes, was just another spy, another handler, another person whose relationship with her had been built on professional obligation rather than genuine affection. "How many people in my life are real?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your feelings are real," David said, stepping closer to her but stopping when he saw her flinch away from his approach. "Your accomplishments are real. Your intelligence, your kindness, your strength, those are all genuinely you. The organization didn't create those qualities, they identified them and created circumstances to help them flourish." "That's supposed to comfort me?" Sarah's voice rose with the first spark of anger she had felt since this nightmare had begun. "You're telling me that I'm authentic, but my entire life has been a performance directed by people I didn't even know existed?" Father McKenna consulted his watch with the casual gesture of someone accustomed to keeping tight schedules. "Sarah Matthews, the ceremony must proceed. Do you take this mission with all its requirements and obligations as your solemn duty to your country and your family?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended over her head, and Sarah realized that everything, her future, her family's safety, her very identity, hinged on her answer to a question that had been designed to sound like wedding vows, but was actually something far more sinister. Sarah's world tilted on its axis as she stood frozen at the altar, surrounded by the elaborate deception that had been her entire life. The cathedral's stained glass windows, which moments before had seemed like
benevolent guardians blessing her wedding, now felt like the eyes of an all-seeing organization that had been watching her every move since birth. The weight of the decision pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden, and she realized that whatever choice she made would irrevocably alter not just her future, but her understanding of her past. "I need a moment," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the expectant silence. "This is insane! You're asking me to agree to something I don't understand, to join an organization I've never heard of, to accept that everything I believed about my life has been a lie?" Father McKenna's expression remained impassive, but she caught a subtle hand signal he made toward the mysterious guests scattered throughout the cathedral. Several of them shifted in their seats, their movements coordinated with military precision. The message was clear: her time for deliberation was limited, and resistance would be met with swift action. "Sarah," her father's voice rang out from the front pew, and she turned to see Robert Matthews standing with the dignity befitting a federal judge, but also with the wariness of a man who had been carrying secrets for too long. "I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to understand something crucial. Your grandmother, Catherine, didn't die of a heart attack when you were 10 years old." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her grandmother, the gentle woman who had taught her to bake cookies and told her bedtime stories about brave princesses, had been the cornerstone of Sarah's childhood, and her death had been one of the most formative losses of her young life. "She was killed on a mission in Eastern Europe," Robert continued, his voice heavy with grief that had been hidden for 15 years. "She died protecting intelligence that saved thousands of American lives, and her sacrifice has been classified at the highest levels of government. The heart attack story was a cover, designed to protect you and your sister from knowing the truth until you were old enough to understand." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as another piece of her reality crumbled. "You let me grieve for a lie?" she whispered, the words carrying both heartbreak and accusation. "We let you grieve for the loss, which was real," her mother Eleanor spoke for the first time, rising from her seat with tears streaming down her face. "The love Catherine had for you was real. The story she told you, the lesson she taught you, the value she instilled in you, those were all genuine. The only lie was how she died, and we told that lie to protect you from a world we hoped you would never have to enter." David stepped closer, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Sarah, I know how this looks, how this feels, but you have to believe me when I tell you that my feelings for you are genuine. Yes, I was assigned to evaluate you, to get close to you, to report on your suitability for recruitment. But somewhere along the way, the assignment became secondary to what I felt for you." "How can I believe anything you say?" Sarah's voice cracked with the weight of betrayal. "How can I trust a single word from any of you when my entire life has been built on deception?" "Because," Jessica stepped forward, and for the first time since this nightmare began, her expression showed genuine emotion rather than professional detachment. "Yes, I was assigned to be your friend, but you can't fake 8 years of shared experiences, late-night conversations, supporting each other through everything life threw at us. The assignment might have brought us together, but what we built was real." Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Father McKenna cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the ceremony that had devolved into a family intervention. "Sarah Matthews, while these personal discussions are touching, we have operational timelines to maintain. Your first mission briefing begins in 6 hours, and your new identity documents must be prepared before then." "My first mission?" Sarah's voice rose with incredulous anger. "I haven't even agreed to join your organization, and you're already planning my first mission?"
"Your agreement is not in question," one of the mysterious guests spoke the first time, a woman with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice who had been sitting in the fourth pew. "Your psychological profile indicates a 97.3% probability of cooperation once all relevant factors have been disclosed. The 2.7% margin of error is accounted for by contingency protocols that ensure your participation regardless of your initial response." The casual way the woman discussed probability calculations and contingency protocols made Sarah's blood run cold. These people weren't just manipulative, they were methodical, scientific in their approach to controlling human behavior. She was not a person to them. She was a variable in an equation, a resource to be deployed according to their strategic needs. "What kind of mission?" Sarah asked, realizing that she needed to understand the full scope of what they expected from her before she could even begin to formulate a response. Father McKenna opened the folder David had provided and withdrew a series of photographs that he placed on the altar beside the ornate wedding candles. The images showed a series of faces, men and women of various ages and ethnicities, but all sharing a certain hardness around the eyes that suggested lives lived in the shadows. These individuals represent a terrorist cell that has been planning an attack on American soil for the past 18 months. Traditional intelligence agencies have been unable to penetrate their organization because they recruit exclusively from academic institutions, targeting individuals with advanced degrees and clean backgrounds who would never appear on standard watch lists. Sarah studied the photographs, her mind automatically cataloging details and connections, a habit that she now realized had been cultivated through years of training disguised as education. One face in particular caught her attention, a young woman who looked remarkably similar to Sarah herself, with the same dark hair and general bone structure.
Your resemblance to their latest recruit is not coincidental, the silver-haired woman continued. Dr. Elena Vasquez completed her doctorate in international relations at Columbia University 3 months ago and has been recruited by the cell for her expertise in American political structures. Unfortunately, Dr. Vasquez suffered a tragic accident last week, an accident that our organization arranged to create an opening for your insertion into their group. The implications of what the silver-haired woman had just revealed crashed over Sarah like a tsunami of horror. They had killed someone, murdered an innocent woman, to create an operational opportunity. The photographs trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at the face of Dr. Elena Vasquez, a woman whose only crime had been possessing a doctoral degree and bearing a physical resemblance to Sarah. "You murdered her." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried across the cathedral with the force of an accusation that made several of the mysterious guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. Vasquez's death was regrettable, Father McKenna acknowledged, with the same emotional investment he might have shown discussing the weather. But her sacrifice will save thousands of American lives when we prevent the terrorist attack she would have inadvertently facilitated through her involvement with the cell. She didn't choose to sacrifice anything. Sarah's voice rose to a shout that echoed off the cathedral's vaulted ceilings. You murdered her. David reached toward her, but she jerked away from his touch as if it burned. The man she had planned to marry, the man she had trusted with her heart and her dreams, was part of an organization that viewed human life as expendable in service of their shadowy objectives. How many other regrettable deaths had he been party to during their relationship? Sarah, her mother's voice carried the weight of years of hidden knowledge. You need to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. The terrorist cell has already acquired materials for a chemical weapon that could kill tens of thousands of people in a major metropolitan area. Elena Vasquez was going to help them identify the optimal target location and timing for maximum casualties. Her linguistic skills and cultural knowledge made her an invaluable asset to their operation.
So you murdered her to stop her from helping terrorists she didn't even know she was helping? Sarah's logic felt like it was fracturing under the weight of moral complexities she had never been forced to consider. The silver-haired woman stood and approached the altar with the measured pace of someone accustomed to delivering difficult briefings. Sarah Matthews, your emotional response to Dr. Vasquez's termination indicates that you will require extensive psychological conditioning before you can function effectively in operational environments. The ability to compartmentalize moral concerns for the greater good is essential for agents working at your intended classification level. The clinical language, termination, psychological conditioning, compartmentalize moral concerns revealed the true nature of the organization that had been manipulating her life. They weren't patriots serving their country. They were sociopaths who had learned to justify any action by claiming it served a greater purpose. And if I refuse to undergo your psychological conditioning? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Then you will join Dr. Vasquez in the category of regrettable necessities, she replied, with chilling matter-of-factness. Your knowledge of this organization, even the limited exposure you've had today, makes you a security risk that cannot be allowed to exist outside of our control. The threat was unmistakable, and Sarah realized that she had crossed a line simply by being present for this conversation. There was no going back to her old life, no returning to the comfortable illusion of normalcy she had lived with for 26 years. The choice wasn't whether to join the organization, it was whether to join willingly or be forced into compliance through methods that would likely break her spirit along with her resistance. Father McKenna consulted his watch again, and Sarah noticed that the late afternoon light filtering through the stained glass windows had begun to fade toward evening. How long had this confrontation been going on? It felt like hours, but also like mere minutes since her world had been turned upside down. Your insertion into the terrorist cell must occur within the next 72 hours, he announced. Elena Vasquez was scheduled to meet her contact tomorrow evening in a cultural center in Arlington. You will keep that appointment, assume her identity, and begin the infiltration process immediately. I don't know anything about being a spy. I don't know how to fight, how to lie convincingly, how to maintain a false identity. You're asking me to impersonate someone I've never met to infiltrate a group of people who will kill me if they discover my deception. Your training began in childhood, Jessica said, stepping closer with an expression that mixed professional assessment with genuine concern. The piano lessons developed your finger dexterity and hand-eye coordination, essential for weapons handling. The language classes gave you linguistic flexibility, crucial for accent work and cultural adaptation. The debate team training taught you to think on your feet and argue from positions you don't personally believe. Perfect preparation for maintaining false identities. The State Department internship included firearms training disguised as security awareness sessions, David added, his voice heavy with guilt. Your performance indicated natural aptitude for marksmanship and tactical thinking. The self-defense classes you took in college weren't random choices. They were suggestions planted by operatives who had identified deficiencies in your physical combat skills. Every revelation stripped away another layer of Sarah's identity, revealing the calculating precision with which her entire life had been orchestrated. She wasn't a person who had made independent choices about her education, her interests, her relationships. She was a carefully crafted weapon that had been shaped and honed by people who saw her as nothing more than a tool to be deployed when needed. The mission parameters are non-negotiable, Father McKenna continued relentlessly. Your insertion into the terrorist cell must occur within the next 72 hours. Elena Vasquez was scheduled to meet her contact tomorrow evening in a cultural center in Arlington. You will keep that appointment, assume her identity, and begin the infiltration process immediately.
I don't know anything about being a spy, Sarah protested. I don't know how to fight, how to lie convincingly, how to maintain a false identity.
You're asking me to impersonate someone I've never met, to infiltrate a group of people who will kill me if they discover my deception. Your training began in childhood, Jessica said, stepping closer with an expression that mixed professional assessment with genuine concern. The piano lessons developed your finger dexterity and hand-eye coordination, essential for weapons handling. The language classes gave you linguistic flexibility, crucial for accent work and cultural adaptation. The debate team training taught you to think on your feet and argue from positions you don't personally believe. Perfect preparation for maintaining false identities. Sarah stared at her oldest friend, realizing that every shared memory was now contaminated by the knowledge that Jessica had been evaluating and reporting on her throughout their entire relationship. The girl who had comforted her through her first heartbreak had been taking notes for a file that would eventually determine her suitability for assassination work. The mission parameters are non-negotiable, Father McKenna continued relentlessly. You will assume Elena Vasquez's identity, infiltrate the terrorist cell, identify their operational plans, and provide intelligence that will allow us to neutralize the threat before they can execute their attack. The weight of the mission Father McKenna described settled on Sarah's shoulders like a crushing burden. Assume another woman's identity, a woman they had murdered to create this opportunity. Infiltrate a group of terrorists who would undoubtedly kill her if they discovered her deception. Somehow gather intelligence from people trained in operational security and counter-surveillance. The scope of what they expected from her was staggering, especially considering that until 30 minutes ago, she had been a graduate student planning to spend her honeymoon in Tuscany. You're insane, Sarah said, shaking her head in disbelief. I'm not a trained operative. I don't have the skills, the experience, the psychological preparation for something like this. You're sending me on a suicide mission. You have more preparation than you realize, the silver-haired woman interjected, producing a thick manila folder from her purse. Sarah Elizabeth Matthews, born October 15, 1997, daughter of Robert and Eleanor Matthews, granddaughter of Catherine and James Matthews. Your psychological profile spans 47 pages of detailed analysis compiled over 15 years of observation. She opened the folder, revealing page after page of typed reports, photographs, and analytical assessments that documented Sarah's life with scientific precision. Age 7, demonstrated exceptional pattern recognition abilities during standardized testing, suggesting aptitude for code breaking and intelligence analysis. Age 12, showed remarkable emotional resilience following her grandmother's death, indicating capacity to function under extreme psychological stress. Age 16, displayed natural leadership qualities during crisis simulation exercises disguised as school emergency drills. Sarah stared at the folder, horrified by the realization that her entire life had been monitored and documented with the same attention to detail that might be given to a laboratory specimen. Every achievement, every setback, every moment of personal growth had been recorded and analyzed for its relevance to her eventual recruitment. Age 22, the woman continued, demonstrated advanced analytical thinking during her master's thesis research, successfully identifying security vulnerabilities in Eastern European political systems that aligned perfectly with current intelligence priorities. Age 24, showed exceptional stress management and adaptability during her State Department internship, maintaining professional performance even under artificially induced pressure situations. Artificially induced pressure? Sarah's voice carried a note of dawning horror as she began to understand the full scope of the manipulation she had endured. David stepped forward, his expression tortured with guilt. The crisis scenarios during your internship, the bomb threat that locked down the building, the security breach that required emergency evacuation protocols, the hostile foreign diplomat who tried to intimidate you during that cultural exchange meeting, they were all staged exercises designed to evaluate your performance under pressure.
Sarah felt her knees weaken as the memory of those terrifying incidents took on new meaning. The bomb threat that had sent her heart racing as she followed evacuation procedures had been fake. The security breach that had made her feel vulnerable and exposed had been choreographed. The hostile diplomat whose aggressive questioning had left her shaken but determined to maintain professional composure had been an actor hired to test her responses. "Every trauma was manufactured," she whispered, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "Every trauma was overcome," her father corrected, his voice carrying both pride and regret. "Sarah, you need to understand something fundamental about who you are. The organization didn't create your strength, your intelligence, your resilience, or your moral courage. They identified those qualities and created circumstances to help them develop. The person you are, the core of your identity, that's authentic." But Sarah wasn't convinced. How could she trust her own sense of self when every formative experience had been manipulated by people with ulterior motives? Was her love of literature genuine, or had it been cultivated because linguistic skills were operationally useful? Were her close friendships real, or had every person in her social circle been placed there for strategic reasons? Father McKenna placed the photographs of the terrorist cell members back into the folder and closed it with finality. Sarah Matthews, the philosophical questions about identity and authenticity are luxuries we cannot afford at this moment. The terrorist cell is operating on an accelerated timeline, and Dr. Vasquez's absence will only go unnoticed for so long before they begin asking questions that could compromise the entire operation. "What exactly would I have to do?" Sarah asked, realizing that understanding the specific requirements might help her find a way to refuse or at least negotiate better terms. The silver-haired woman produced another folder, this one containing detailed dossiers on each member of the terrorist cell. Elena Vasquez was recruited to provide cultural and linguistic consultation for target selection. The cell leader, Dr. Rashid Hassan, is a brilliant strategist but lacks intimate knowledge of American social structures and population patterns. Your job would be to provide that knowledge while secretly documenting their operational plans, communication protocols, and weapons storage locations. Sarah studied the photographs and biographical information, her analytical mind automatically processing the details despite her emotional turmoil. Dr. Hassan held dual doctorates in chemistry and political science, a combination that made him uniquely dangerous as a terrorist leader. His second-in-command, Maria Santos, had a background in logistics and supply chain management that would be invaluable for moving weapons and personnel without detection. "They're not stereotypical terrorists," Sarah observed, noting the academic credentials and professional accomplishments detailed in each file. Which is precisely why traditional intelligence agencies have been unable to infiltrate their organization. They recruit from university environments, targeting individuals who would never appear on standard watch lists because their backgrounds are exemplary. They're hiding in plain sight among America's educated elite. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She was being recruited by one shadowy organization to infiltrate another, and both groups operated by identifying talented individuals and manipulating them into service through a combination of deception and coercion. Your academic expertise in cultural analysis makes you uniquely qualified to understand their target selection criteria, Father McKenna continued, producing a detailed map of Washington, D.C. with various locations marked in red ink. Dr. Hassan's group has been studying American population patterns, transportation hubs, and emergency response capabilities for months. Elena Vasquez was brought in to provide the final piece of their puzzle: intimate knowledge of how Americans think, how they react to crisis situations, and where they congregate in the largest numbers during peak vulnerability windows. Sarah studied the map with growing horror, recognizing that the red marks corresponded to some of the most densely populated areas in the nation's capital: Union Station, Reagan National Airport, the Smithsonian Museums during tourist season, major shopping centers during holiday periods. Each location represented thousands of potential casualties if a chemical weapons attack succeeded. They've been planning this for over 2 years, the silver-haired woman added, her voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone who had spent decades analyzing terrorist methodologies. The level of sophistication, the depth of their research, the quality of their operational security, this is not a group of amateur extremists. These are highly educated individuals who understand both the scientific and psychological aspects of mass casualty terrorism. The weight of what Sarah was being asked to do settled on her shoulders like a crushing burden. She wasn't just being recruited to play a role in some abstract intelligence operation. She was being asked to infiltrate a group of brilliant, methodical killers who had spent years preparing to murder thousands of innocent Americans. The margin for error was essentially zero, and failure would mean not just her own death, but the success of an attack that could traumatize the entire nation. I need to understand the timeline, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the chaos raging in her mind. How long do I have to gather the intelligence you need? When is the attack scheduled to occur? What specific information do you need me to obtain? Father McKenna consulted the secure files one more time, his expression grave as he processed the operational requirements. Based on intercepted communications and surveillance of their activities, we believe the attack is scheduled for Friday evening during rush hour, exactly 78 hours from now. Your window for gathering actionable intelligence is extremely narrow, which is why Elena Vasquez's death, as tragic as it was, actually provides us with a critical opportunity. The compressed timeline was terrifying, but Sarah recognized that it also worked in her favor. A longer infiltration would have required her to maintain the deception for weeks or months, increasing the likelihood of exposure. A short-term operation would allow her to focus on gathering specific intelligence rather than building long-term relationships that could reveal inconsistencies in her cover identity. As the cathedral bells chimed 9 o'clock, Sarah realized that she was running out of time to make a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of her life.
The wedding that should have been the beginning of her happily ever after had become the end of her innocence, and the beginning of something far more dangerous and morally complex than she had ever imagined possible.
The weight of the 78-hour timeline pressed down on Sarah as she processed everything she had learned about the terrorist cell and their planned attack. As she studied the terrorist cell files more closely, a chilling realization began to crystallize in her mind. The academic backgrounds, the sophisticated recruitment methods, the focus on cultural infiltration rather than brute force. This terrorist organization operated with the same calculated precision as the shadowy group that had been manipulating her own life. The line between the people she was supposed to stop and the people who were forcing her to stop them was disturbingly thin. "How do I know you're the good guys?" Sarah asked, her voice cutting through the cathedral's oppressive atmosphere. "How do I know that everything you've told me about this terrorist threat isn't just another lie designed to manipulate me into compliance?" Father McKenna's expression darkened, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah saw genuine emotion flicker across his features. Anger, perhaps even respect for her perceptiveness. "That question demonstrates exactly why you're valuable to us, Sarah. Most people in your situation would be too overwhelmed to think strategically, but you're already analyzing the situation from multiple angles." "That's not an answer," Sarah pressed, her analytical training helping her maintain focus despite the emotional chaos surrounding her. "You've admitted to lying about my family history, murdering an innocent woman, and orchestrating every significant relationship in my life. Why should I believe anything you tell me about these terrorists?" The silver-haired woman approached the altar and placed a tablet device beside the terrorist files. With a few swift gestures, she activated a video that began playing on the screen. The image showed a laboratory setting where individuals in hazmat suits were working with chemical compounds that Sarah's graduate-level chemistry knowledge allowed her to identify as extremely dangerous. This footage was obtained from surveillance equipment we planted in Dr. Hassan's facility 3 weeks ago. The compound they're synthesizing is a binary chemical weapon, harmless when stored as separate components, but lethal when combined and dispersed through an aerosol delivery system.
Sarah watched the video with growing horror as the scope of the threat became clear. The individuals in the laboratory moved with professional competence, suggesting extensive training in chemical weapons production. The quantities of raw materials visible in the background indicated preparation for a large-scale attack, not the small-scale violence typically associated with terrorist operations. The target location they've selected is Union Station during the evening rush hour on Friday. Conservative estimates suggest casualties in the range of 15 to 20,000 people, with potential contamination affecting a much larger area depending on wind patterns and atmospheric conditions. The photographs showed detailed surveillance of Union Station's layout, including ventilation systems, crowd flow patterns, and security arrangements. The level of planning evident in the materials was staggering, suggesting months of preparation and substantial financial resources. David stepped forward, his expression tortured with guilt but also desperate urgency. "Sarah, I know you have every reason not to trust anything I say, but you have to believe this. The threat is real. I've seen the intelligence reports, the chemical analysis, the intercepted communications. These people are going to kill thousands of innocent Americans in less than 96 hours unless someone stops them. And that someone has to be me?" Sarah's voice carried both fear and a growing sense of resolve that surprised her. Despite everything she had learned about the manipulation and deception that had shaped her life, the thought of thousands of innocent people dying while she had the power to prevent it created a moral imperative that transcended her personal grievances. Elena Vasquez was their inside consultant on American cultural patterns and population density analysis, Jessica explained, her professional demeanor cracking to reveal genuine urgency. Without her input, they might delay the attack or choose a less effective target, but they won't abandon their operation entirely. You're the only person who can step into her role quickly enough to gather the intelligence we need to stop them. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process the impossible situation she found herself in. Accept the mission, and she would be risking her life to infiltrate a group of highly trained terrorists while working for an organization that had systematically destroyed everything she thought she knew about her own identity. Refuse, and thousands of innocent people would die, assuming the threat was real, or not just another elaborate manipulation designed to ensure her compliance. "What guarantees do I have?" Sarah asked, opening her eyes to meet Father McKenna's gaze directly. "What assurance do I have that you won't simply dispose of me once the mission is complete, like you did with Elena Vasquez?" "You have the guarantee of your own value," the silver-haired woman replied with clinical honesty. Dr. Vasquez was expendable because she was an unwitting asset, useful for a single operation but representing a security risk once her involvement ended. You, however, represent a much more valuable long-term investment. Your training, your psychological profile, your family connections, and your proven performance under pressure make you suitable for decades of operational work. The promise of decades of operational work was hardly reassuring, but Sarah recognized the strategic logic behind it. A trained operative represented years of investment and development that the organization wouldn't casually discard. Elena Vasquez was an outsider who could be eliminated without significant loss, but Sarah was being groomed as a permanent asset whose value would only increase over time. "I need to know about my sister," Sarah said suddenly, remembering the earlier thread about Emily's safety. "You mentioned she's studying in Prague, but now I'm wondering if that's even true." Robert Matthews stood from his seat in the front pew, his judicial bearing evident even in this surreal situation. "Emily is safe, Sarah. She's completing a semester abroad program at Charles University, studying Renaissance art history. She has no knowledge of any of this, and if you cooperate fully with the organization, she never will. She can live the normal life that circumstances have made impossible for you."
The weight of protecting her younger sister added another layer of complexity to Sarah's decision. Emily was only 22, brilliant and idealistic, with dreams of becoming a museum curator. The thought of her sister being drawn into this world of shadows and deception was unbearable, but it also provided the organization with perfect leverage to ensure Sarah's continued cooperation.
The manipulation was expertly crafted. Offer Sarah the illusion of choice while making it clear that every alternative led to unacceptable consequences.
refuse the mission, and thousands of innocent people would die while her sister became a target for elimination. Accept the mission, and she would be trading her freedom for the safety of others, binding herself to an organization that viewed human life as expendable resources in their strategic calculations. "I want to see the rest of the intelligence," Sarah said, her voice steadying as she made the decision to engage with the operational details rather than continuing to fight the inevitable. "If I'm going to risk my life infiltrating these people, I need to understand everything: their communication methods, their security protocols, their personal relationships, their psychological profiles." Father McKenna nodded approvingly, recognizing the shift from resistance to tactical planning. "Your strategic thinking is exactly what we hoped to see. The transition from emotional reaction to operational analysis indicates that your psychological conditioning is more advanced than we initially assessed." The casual reference to psychological conditioning sent another chill through Sarah, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate threat rather than the long-term implications of her recruitment. The silver-haired woman produced a secure laptop and opened encrypted files that contained detailed surveillance reports on each member of the terrorist cell. Dr. Rashid Hassan, the cell leader, is a brilliant but psychologically unstable individual who views the planned attack as an intellectual challenge rather than an act of violence, she explained, displaying psychological assessments that painted a picture of a dangerous academic who had radicalized gradually over several years. His doctoral dissertation on political theory contained early indicators of extremist thinking that our monitoring systems identified and flagged for further observation. Sarah studied Hassan's file with the same analytical intensity she had once applied to her graduate research, noting patterns in his academic work and personal relationships that revealed a man whose intellectual arrogance had evolved into megalomaniacal delusions about reshaping American society through targeted violence. "Maria Santos represents a different type of threat," the woman continued, switching to another file. "She's motivated by personal revenge rather than ideological conviction. Her brother was killed in a drone strike overseas 3 years ago, a strike that eliminated a legitimate terrorist target but resulted in civilian casualties that included her family members." The complexity of Santos's motivations added another layer of difficulty to the infiltration mission. Unlike Hassan, whose academic arrogance made him potentially predictable, Santos was driven by personal grief and rage that could make her unpredictably dangerous if she suspected infiltration. David approached the laptop and highlighted additional files that detailed the cell's operational structure. "They operate with strict compartmentalization. Each member knows only their specific role and has limited contact with others outside of scheduled meetings. Elena Vasquez was brought in as an external consultant specifically because her academic credentials and cultural expertise were needed for target analysis." "Which means they don't know her personally," Sarah observed, "both an opportunity and a vulnerability in the arrangement. I won't have to maintain relationships or personal connections that could reveal inconsistencies in my impersonation." "Exactly," Jessica confirmed, her professional assessment taking precedence over their personal history. "Your interaction with the cell will be limited and task-focused, which plays to your strengths in analytical thinking and reduces the risk of exposure through personal details you couldn't possibly know." Father McKenna consulted his watch again, and Sarah noticed that the cathedral's interior had grown significantly darker as the evening had progressed. The stained glass windows that had earlier painted rainbow fragments across the altar now appeared as dark silhouettes against the night sky, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a crypt than a sacred space. "Your extraction from the cathedral must occur within the next 30 minutes, he announced. "Elena Vasquez's apartment has been prepared with personal belongings and documentation that will support your cover identity. You'll have tonight and tomorrow morning to familiarize yourself with her background before the first contact with the terrorist cell tomorrow evening." The compressed timeline was staggering,
less than 24 hours to assume a dead woman's identity and prepare for the most dangerous mission of her life. She felt a moment of panic as the reality of what she was agreeing to crashed over her with renewed force. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, the admission escaping before she could stop it. Her mother rose from her seat and approached the altar, tears streaming down her face, but her expression filled with fierce maternal pride. "Sarah Elizabeth Matthews, you are the granddaughter of Catherine Matthews, who parachuted behind enemy lines in occupied France and spent 3 years gathering intelligence that helped win World War II. You are the daughter of parents who have spent their entire adult lives serving their country in ways that can never be acknowledged or celebrated. You carry the DNA, the training, and the moral courage of a family that has dedicated itself to protecting innocent people from those who would do them harm." Eleanor reached out and took Sarah's hands, her grip firm despite the trembling in her fingers. "You can do this, because you are already doing it. You're standing here facing an impossible situation with grace and intelligence, asking the right questions, thinking strategically about protecting others, even while processing your own betrayal and fear. That's who you are, sweetheart. Not because the organization made you that way, but because that's who you've always been." The words carried weight that transcended the manipulation and deception that had brought them to this moment. Sarah felt something stirring within her, not resignation to her fate, but a growing recognition of her own capabilities and a fierce determination to ensure that the sacrifices forced upon her would serve a meaningful purpose. "What happens after the mission?" Sarah asked, her voice stronger than it had been since this ordeal had begun. "That depends entirely on your performance and your willingness to embrace your role within the organization," the silver-haired woman replied with characteristic directness. "Exceptional operatives are rewarded with increasing autonomy and responsibility. Those who prove themselves indispensable earn the privilege of helping to shape future operations rather than simply executing them."
The promise of eventual autonomy within the organization was both appealing and terrifying. Appealing because it offered the possibility of influence over future operations, but terrifying because it implied decades of involvement in activities that would require her to compromise her moral principles on a regular basis. Sarah realized that accepting this mission meant accepting a fundamental transformation of her identity, from an idealistic graduate student to a professional operative, whose survival would depend on her ability to lie, manipulate, and potentially kill when necessary. "I need to know about the extraction plan," Sarah said, forcing herself to focus on operational details rather than the existential implications of her decision. "How do I get the intelligence back to you once I've gathered it? How do I get out safely if the operation goes wrong?" Father McKenna opened another section of the secure files, revealing detailed floor plans and emergency protocols that had been developed specifically for this mission. "You'll be equipped with a subdermal communication device that will allow you to transmit intelligence in real time without carrying any detectable equipment. The device is surgically implanted and powered by your body's bioelectrical field, completely undetectable by conventional security screening." The mention of surgical implantation made Sarah's stomach lurch. The organization wasn't just asking her to impersonate someone else, they were asking her to allow them to permanently alter her body with their technology. The violation felt profound, another step in the systematic destruction of her autonomy and bodily integrity. "The implantation procedure is minimally invasive," the silver-haired woman added, noting Sarah's expression of revulsion. "A small incision behind your right ear, local anesthetic, 15 minutes of surgery, and 24 hours of healing time. The scar will be virtually invisible once it heals." "And if I want it removed after the mission?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The device includes a fail-safe mechanism that prevents unauthorized removal. Any attempt to tamper with the implant will result in the release of a neurotoxin that causes immediate cardiac arrest. The device is designed to be a permanent addition to your operational capabilities."
The mention of a kill switch embedded in her own body drove home the reality of what she was accepting. The organization wasn't just recruiting her, they were claiming ownership of her, ensuring her compliance through the ultimate threat, that any attempt to escape or resist would result in immediate death. David stepped closer, his expression tortured with guilt and desperate love. Sarah, I know how this sounds, how all of this looks from your perspective, but I need you to understand something. The people in this organization, they're not monsters. They're individuals who have made difficult choices in service of protecting innocent lives. Every operation, every sacrifice, every morally ambiguous decision is made in service of preventing greater suffering. They murdered Elena Vasquez, Sarah reminded him, her voice carrying the weight of moral judgment that hadn't been dulled by his explanations. Yes, David acknowledged without attempting to justify or minimize the act. And that death will save thousands of lives if it allows us to stop the chemical weapons attack. It's a terrible calculus, but it's the reality of the world these people operate in. Sometimes preventing greater evil requires accepting lesser evil. Sarah stared at the man she had planned to marry, recognizing that this conversation was revealing fundamental differences in their moral frameworks that she had never suspected during their 2 years together. David could accept utilitarian calculations that treated human life as expendable in service of strategic objectives, while she was struggling with the basic premise that murder could be justified by potentially saving other lives. The terrorist cell's attack will occur in 3 days, Jessica interjected, her tone carrying professional urgency. Every hour of delay increases the risk that they'll detect Elena Vasquez's absence and modify their operational plans. We need your decision now, Sarah, not just for the sake of the mission, but for your own safety. The implication was clear. The organization had already committed to using Sarah for this operation, and her cooperation would determine whether she entered their service willingly or was coerced through methods that would be far more traumatic than the surgical implantation of a communication device. Father McKenna closed the laptop and gathered the files with movements that suggested the briefing phase of the evening was concluding. Sarah Matthews, the formal question remains before you. Do you accept this mission, with all its requirements and obligations, as your duty to your country and your commitment to preventing the deaths of thousands of innocent Americans? The question hung in the sanctuary's air like a physical presence, demanding an answer that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. Sarah looked around the sanctuary one final time, taking in the faces of everyone who had participated in this elaborate deception. Her parents, her fiancé, her best friend, the mysterious operatives who had been watching her for years. Every person in this sacred space had been part of the conspiracy that had brought her to this moment, and now they were waiting for her to formally accept the role they had been preparing her to play since childhood. If I do this, Sarah said slowly, if I accept this mission and infiltrate these terrorists and help you stop their attack, I need something in return. You're not in a position to negotiate terms, the silver-haired woman replied, sharply. I'm in a position to cooperate willingly or resist every step of the way, so I'm offering you a trade, my complete cooperation in exchange for certain guarantees. Father McKenna studied her with what might have been approval, recognizing that her strategic thinking remained intact despite the emotional trauma of the evening's revelations. State your terms. My sister remains completely ignorant of this world and dies of old age in her bed, surrounded by grandchildren who never know that any of this existed. My parents are allowed to retire from whatever roles they've been playing and live normal lives without operational obligations. And after this mission is complete, I get full briefings on any future operations I'm expected to participate in, with the right to refuse assignments that violate my personal moral code.
The silence that followed Sarah's demands was pregnant with tension, as the assembled operatives processed her attempt to negotiate terms with an organization that clearly wasn't accustomed to having their authority challenged. Father McKenna exchanged glances with the silver-haired woman, and Sarah caught subtle hand signals passing between them, some form of communication that suggested they were consulting with higher authorities through methods she couldn't detect. Your first 2 conditions are acceptable, Father McKenna finally responded, and align with standard protocols for protecting family members of active operatives. Your third condition, however, demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how this organization functions.
Explain, Sarah said, maintaining the steady tone that had carried her through this nightmare so far. The silver-haired woman stepped forward, her expression carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades navigating the moral complexities of intelligence work. Sarah Matthews, the luxury of maintaining personal moral codes is something that civilian academics can afford, but operational personnel must be prepared to act according to strategic necessities that transcend individual ethical frameworks. You're asking me to abandon my conscience, Sarah replied, recognizing the fundamental demand underlying their recruitment. We're asking you to expand your understanding of moral responsibility, David interjected, his voice carrying desperate urgency. Sarah, in 6 months or a year, when you've seen intelligence reports about attacks that were prevented, terrorist networks that were dismantled, weapons of mass destruction that were intercepted before they could be deployed, you'll understand that sometimes the greatest moral good requires actions that would seem unconscionable from a limited perspective. The philosophical argument was sophisticated, Sarah had to admit, but it represented exactly the kind of utilitarian thinking that had allowed the organization to justify murdering Elena Vasquez and systematically manipulating her own life. The slope from "sometimes the greater good requires difficult choices" to "any action can be justified if it serves our strategic objectives" was shorter and more slippery than David seemed to realize. "I need time to consider this," Sarah said, playing for more information while trying to delay the final commitment they were demanding. "Time is not a luxury we can afford," Father McKenna replied, consulting his watch with obvious impatience. "The surgical implantation must occur within the next 2 hours to allow sufficient healing time before your first contact with the terrorist cell. Every minute of delay increases the operational risk and reduces our margin for error." Sarah realized that the compressed timeline was itself a manipulation tactic. By creating artificial urgency, they were preventing her from thinking through the long-term implications of her decision and forcing her to focus on the immediate crisis rather than the broader pattern of coercion and control that defined their relationship with her. "What happens if the mission fails?" Sarah asked, recognizing that understanding the consequences of failure might help her evaluate the true level of risks she was accepting. "Mission failure is not an acceptable outcome," the silver-haired woman replied with chilling finality. "The chemical weapons attack will proceed as planned, resulting in mass casualties that could have been prevented. Your cover identity will likely be compromised, resulting in your capture and execution by the terrorist cell. The organization's existence will be partially exposed, requiring extensive damage control measures that would impact other ongoing operations worldwide." The stakes were even higher than Sarah had initially understood. Not only was she risking her own life, but failure would have cascading consequences that would endanger other operatives and potentially allow future terrorist attacks to succeed. The weight of responsibility was staggering. Thousands of innocent lives depended on her ability to successfully impersonate a dead woman and infiltrate a group of highly trained killers. "I need to speak with David alone," Sarah said, recognizing that she needed to understand the man she had planned to marry before she could make any decision about her future. Father McKenna looked as if he might refuse, but the silver-haired woman nodded slightly. 5 minutes, she announced. The surgical team is already en route to the medical facility where the implantation will occur. The other operatives filed out of the cathedral, leaving Sarah and David alone in the vast sanctuary that had been transformed from a sacred space into the site of her recruitment. The silence between them was heavy with years of shared experiences that now carried entirely different meanings. "Was any of it real?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David's facade cracked completely, revealing the emotional devastation that his professional demeanor had been concealing. "Everything I felt for you, Sarah, was real. Every moment we spent together, every conversation we had, every plan we made for our future, my feelings were genuine, even if the circumstances that brought us together were orchestrated." "How can I believe that?" Sarah's voice cracked with the weight of betrayal that threatened to overwhelm her analytical thinking. "Because I'm about to ask you to do something that could get us both killed," David replied, glancing towards the cathedral's doors to ensure they were truly alone. The organization's version of events isn't completely accurate. Elena Vasquez wasn't murdered by our people. She was killed by the terrorist cell because they suspected she was working with American intelligence. The opportunity for you to replace her isn't the result of calculated assassination. It's the result of the terrorists' own paranoia and security protocols. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything she had been told about the mission and the organization's methods. If David was telling the truth, then the moral calculus she had been struggling with was based on false information designed to maximize her psychological manipulation. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked, recognizing that David was taking enormous personal risks by revealing information that contradicted the official briefing. "Because I love you," he replied, simply, "and because I think you deserve to make this decision based on accurate information rather than carefully crafted lies designed to ensure your compliance."
David's admission that the organization had been lying about Elena Vasquez's death created a cascade of doubt about every piece of information Sarah had been given during this surreal evening. If they were willing to fabricate the circumstances of one murder to manipulate her emotional response, what other elements of their briefing were carefully constructed lies designed to ensure her cooperation? "What else have they lied about?" Sarah asked, her analytical mind racing through the implications of David's revelation. "The timeline for the terrorist attack is accurate," David replied, his voice low and urgent as he kept watch on the cathedral's entrances. "The chemical weapons are real, the target location is correct, and the casualty estimates are conservative, if anything. But the organization's role in Elena's death, the level of surveillance they've maintained on your family, and the true scope of their operational authority, those details have been significantly embellished to maximize your psychological compliance." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and renewed anger wash over her. Relief that the organization wasn't quite as callously murderous as they had portrayed themselves, but anger that they had deliberately traumatized her with false information about their willingness to kill innocent people to achieve their objectives. "How much of what you've told me about yourself is true?" Sarah asked, recognizing that this might be her only opportunity to understand the real David Chen, rather than the carefully constructed persona he had maintained throughout their relationship. "My feelings for you are completely genuine," David repeated, his voice carrying desperate sincerity. "My background, my family history, my education, those are all accurate. But my recruitment into the organization happened much earlier than I led you to believe. I was identified as a potential asset during high school, not graduate school, and my relationship with you began as an assignment before it became something real." The admission stung, but Sarah found herself oddly comforted by David's honesty after hours of manipulation and deception from everyone else in her life. At least he was finally telling her the truth, even if that truth was painful to hear. "What else have they lied about?" Sarah asked, her analytical mind racing through the implications of David's revelation. "Why are you risking your career, your safety, potentially your life to tell me this?" "Because the organization made a mistake when they chose me to evaluate you," David replied, a sad smile flickering across his features. "They assumed that my professional loyalty would override any personal feelings that developed during the assignment. They didn't account for the possibility that I might fall genuinely in love with you and decide that your right to make an informed decision was more important than their operational security." The sound of footsteps echoing through the cathedral interrupted their conversation, and David's expression immediately shifted back to professional alertness. "They're coming back. Sarah, whatever you decide, I want you to know that I'll support you, even if that decision puts us on opposite sides of this conflict." Father McKenna and the silver-haired woman returned to the sanctuary, their expressions suggesting impatience with the delay in Sarah's final decision. "Miss Matthews, the surgical team has arrived and is prepared to proceed with the implantation. We need your consent to move forward with the operation."
Sarah looked at the assembled operatives, recognizing that she was about to make a decision that would define the rest of her life. The weight of thousands of innocent lives hung in the balance, but she also understood that accepting this mission meant accepting a future of moral compromise and psychological manipulation that could ultimately destroy her sense of self. "I have one more question," Sarah said, her voice carrying newfound strength. "What guarantee do I have that you'll honor any agreement we make here tonight? What's to stop you from breaking your promises once I've completed this mission and proven my value as an operative?" "You have the guarantee of mutual dependence," the silver-haired woman replied. "Your knowledge of this organization makes you a security risk that must be managed, but your skills and training make you too valuable to eliminate. We need you functional and cooperative, which means maintaining your psychological stability through reasonable accommodation of your personal concerns." "And if I refuse the mission entirely?" Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer would confirm her worst fears. "Then you represent an unacceptable security risk that must be neutralized through methods that would be regrettable but necessary. Your knowledge of our operations, our personnel, our methods, and our objectives cannot be allowed to exist outside of our direct control." The threat was unmistakable, and Sarah realized that her choice had never been between accepting or refusing the mission. It had been between cooperating willingly or being coerced through increasingly traumatic methods until her resistance was broken entirely. "I accept the mission," Sarah said, the words feeling like stones falling from her lips. "But I want a written agreement regarding my family's protection and my right to receive full briefings on future operations. The organization doesn't provide written agreements. Our word is our bond, and our track record of protecting operatives' families speaks for itself." "Then I want David as my handler for this mission and all future operations," Sarah countered, recognizing that her only hope of maintaining some measure of autonomy was to ensure that at least one person in the organization had genuine personal investment in her welfare. Father McKenna and the silver-haired woman exchanged glances again, their silent communication suggesting consultation with higher authorities. After a moment that felt like an eternity, the silver-haired woman nodded. "Agent Chen will serve as your primary handler for this operation and future assignments, provided his performance meets organizational standards. However, operational protocols may require adjustment of personnel assignments based on strategic necessities that override personal preferences." It wasn't the guarantee Sarah had hoped for, but it was the best compromise she was likely to achieve given her extremely limited bargaining position. The knowledge that David would be involved in her future operations provided some measure of comfort, even though she understood that his primary loyalty would ultimately have to be to the organization rather than to her. "The surgical facility is 12 minutes from here by vehicle," Father McKenna announced, gathering his materials with movements that suggested the briefing phase was definitively concluded. "The implantation procedure will begin immediately upon arrival, followed by a 6-hour recovery period and intensive briefing on Elena Vasquez's background and operational protocols."
As the reality of what she had agreed to settled over her, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm descending like a protective shroud. The decision was made, the die was cast, and now she could focus on the operational requirements rather than continuing to wrestle with philosophical questions about identity, autonomy, and moral compromise. She was about to become someone else entirely, literally assuming the identity of a dead woman to infiltrate a terrorist cell planning mass murder, but at least she understood the parameters of her new existence. The silver-haired woman approached Sarah with a small black case that contained items she described as essential personal effects for maintaining Elena Vasquez's cover identity. Dr. Vasquez wore specific jewelry, carried particular personal items, and had distinctive habits that the terrorist cell might have observed during their previous interactions with her. These details are crucial for maintaining the authenticity of your impersonation. Sarah opened the case to find a delicate silver necklace with a small cross pendant, a vintage leather watch, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, and a smartphone loaded with Elena's personal photos, text message history, and social media accounts. The intimate details of another woman's life reduced to props for a performance that could determine whether thousands of people lived or died. Elena Vasquez had a distinctive way of speaking, slightly formal English with occasional Spanish phrases when she was under stress, Jessica explained, her professional demeanor fully restored now that the operational phase was beginning. She was raised bilingual, but educated primarily in English, which created specific linguistic patterns that you'll need to replicate convincingly. The complexity of the impersonation was staggering. Sarah wasn't just assuming Elena's name and credentials. She was taking on her personality, her mannerisms, her cultural background, and her personal history. Any slip in the performance could expose her to terrorists who would undoubtedly kill her without hesitation if they suspected infiltration. David approached carrying a leather portfolio that contained additional documentation for the mission. Elena's academic work focused on population density analysis and cultural integration patterns in major American cities, he explained, his voice now carrying the professional tone of an intelligence briefer rather than the intimate warmth of a lover. The chilling efficiency with which the terrorists had recruited Elena demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of operational requirements. They hadn't chosen her randomly. They had identified her specific expertise and integrated it into their attack planning with the same methodical precision that Sarah's own handlers had used to prepare her for this moment. Father McKenna consulted his watch one final time and nodded toward the cathedral's main entrance. "The vehicles are waiting outside, Miss Matthews. Your transformation into Elena Vasquez begins now." As they moved toward the cathedral doors, Sarah took one last look around the sacred space where she had expected to begin her married life with David, but had instead been recruited into a shadowy world of espionage and violence. The stained glass windows that had earlier seemed like benevolent guardians now appeared as silent witnesses to the death of her former identity and the birth of something new entirely. The night air outside the cathedral was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of manipulation and coercion she was leaving behind. A convoy of dark sedans waited at the curb, their engines running and their occupants clearly prepared for immediate departure. "Sarah," her mother called out as they approached the vehicles, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and heartbreak that perfectly captured the impossible situation they all found themselves in. "I know this isn't the wedding day you dreamed of, but I need you to know that your father and I are proud of the woman you've become and the choice you've made tonight." Eleanor Matthews embraced her daughter with fierce intensity, whispering words of love and encouragement that carried the weight of a lifetime of shared experiences that would now be forever changed by the knowledge of what had been hidden beneath their surface normalcy. Robert Matthews joined the embrace, his judicial dignity giving way to paternal emotion as he held his daughter close. "Catherine would be proud," he whispered, invoking the grandmother whose true heroism Sarah was only now beginning to understand. "You're carrying on a legacy of service that spans generations, even though the circumstances are not what any of us would have chosen." David stood beside one of the vehicles, his expression torn between professional duty and personal anguish. When Sarah approached, he took her hands one final time, his touch carrying all the tenderness and regret that words couldn't adequately express. "I'll be monitoring every moment of the mission," he promised, his voice barely above a whisper. "If anything goes wrong, if you need extraction, if the situation becomes too dangerous, I'll find a way to get you out, regardless of what the organization says about operational priorities." Sarah squeezed his hands, recognizing that this promise was probably the most honest thing he had said to her all evening. Whatever else had been manipulation and deception, David's love for her and his willingness to risk everything to protect her were genuine. As the convoy pulled away from St. Augustine's Cathedral, Sarah watched through the rear window as the Gothic spires disappeared into the darkness, carrying with them the last remnants of her old life.
The woman who had entered that cathedral in a wedding dress full of dreams and expectations was gone forever, replaced by someone who would need to learn how to kill, how to lie convincingly under pressure, and how to live with the knowledge that everyone she had ever trusted had been playing roles in an elaborate performance designed to shape her into the perfect weapon. The surgical facility turned out to be a nondescript medical building in an industrial district, its windows dark except for one floor, where a team of specialists waited to implant the communication device that would forever bind her to the organization. As the anesthesia began to take effect, Sarah's last conscious thought was a prayer that Elena Vasquez, wherever she was now, would forgive her for stealing her identity in service of preventing the mass murder that Elena herself had knowingly been recruited to facilitate. When Sarah woke 12 hours later, she was no longer Sarah Matthews, graduate student and former bride-to-be. She was Elena Vasquez, terrorist consultant, carrying the hopes of thousands of innocent Americans who would never know that their lives depended on her ability to become someone else entirely. The mission that would define the rest of her existence was about to begin, and there was no turning back from the path that had been chosen for her long before she was born. The organization had finally gotten what they wanted: a perfectly trained operative who would do whatever was necessary to protect innocent lives, even if it meant sacrificing her own identity and moral innocence in the process. But they had also created something they hadn't anticipated: a woman who understood exactly how they operated, and who would spend the rest of her career looking for opportunities to turn their own methods against them. The wedding was over, the mission had begun. And Sarah Matthews, now Elena Vasquez, was about to discover exactly what she was capable of when everything she loved was at stake. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.